In the early months of 1944, something extraordinary was taking shape at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. A test pilot sat in the cockpit of a P-51B Mustang, his fingers wrapped around the throttle as he pushed the engine into territory it had never explored before. The boost pressure climbed steadily, reaching 75 inches of mercury, fed by something completely new. This wasn't standard military fuel. It was something experimental, something marked only as Grade 150. The aircraft climbed higher, and the needle on the airspeed indicator began to tell a story. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang was pushing through 448 miles per hour. Down below, the test engineers watched the instruments, then looked at each other. Their radio crackled with the pilot's voice, confirming what the numbers were already screaming. What they were witnessing wasn't just progress, it was revolution. The liquid flowing through that fighter's fuel system was purple-tinted, a chemical transformation so fundamental that German pilots would soon discover their entire understanding of American air superiority had become obsolete overnight. The war was about to shift beneath their feet, but not because of a new aircraft or brilliant tactics. The catalyst was something far more profound. A fuel that took existing fighters and unlocked capabilities the Luftwaffe believed were impossible. While American and British fuel chemists had cracked the code, German synthetic fuel programs remained trapped in obsolescence. German fighters struggled along on B4 fuel, barely reaching 91 octane on the lean mixture scale. Their best option, C3 fuel, barely matched what the Allies were producing as their baseline 130 grade standard. But the Americans weren't stopping at 130, they'd gone beyond. Refineries across the country were now churning out aviation gasoline with a performance number of 150, something the Germans couldn't even imagine producing in the quantities needed. Consider the brutal mathematics. A P-51 Mustang on standard 130 grade fuel could hit 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. That same aircraft, with that same pilot at that same altitude, simply needed to switch fuel tanks. Running on 150 grade, it exceeded 448 miles per hour. The difference wasn't small. German pilots had learned to respect the Mustang's range and altitude capability. What they didn't know was about to destroy that respect. The Messerschmitt BF-109G, the Luftwaffe's frontline fighter in early 1944, maxed out at 400 miles per hour. The Focke-Wulf 190A could squeeze out 408 miles per hour under the absolute best circumstances. Against Mustangs running the older 130 grade fuel, German pilots could at least maneuver, could find angles of attack, could try to dictate terms. Against Mustangs running 150 grade fuel, German fighters found themselves fundamentally outmatched. No amount of skill, no tactical cleverness, no years of experience could overcome the physics. The story of how this advantage came to exist didn't begin with war. It began with peacetime science. Petroleum chemists understood something elegant and simple. Octane rating measured one thing: how much compression an air-fuel mixture could endure before igniting on its own. Higher compression meant more power from each explosion inside the cylinder. More power meant faster aircraft and higher ceilings. The science was straightforward. The engineering to produce it at industrial scale, that was something else entirely. Back in 1940, when war was already consuming Europe, American aviation fuel production centered on 87-octane gasoline, fine for commercial airlines and training aircraft, dangerously inadequate for fighters. The British, desperate for anything to counter the Luftwaffe's numerical advantage, had partnered with American oil companies. Together they developed 100-octane fuel, and it arrived just when the Battle of Britain was reaching its critical moment. The difference was staggering. British Spitfires and Hurricanes suddenly had 30 to 40 miles per hour they didn't possess before. Climb rates improved by 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. German pilots who'd enjoyed a performance edge suddenly found themselves matched. The momentum had shifted. Then came 130-grade fuel, another leap forward. This fuel, with its 130 performance number, became the backbone of Allied air power through 1943. It roared through Merlin engines in Spitfires and Mustangs, through Allison engines in P-38 Lightnings, and through massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radials in P-47 Thunderbolts. Production ramped up under General James Doolittle, a true visionary who'd spent the 1930s fighting military brass and oil company executives, pushing them to invest in high-octane development. By 1943, 17 Allied refineries were pumping out high-octane fuel using the catalytic cracking process that French engineer Eugene Houdry had perfected. American refineries alone were producing millions of gallons monthly, enough to fuel the massive strategic bombing campaign and the fighter forces escorting those bombers deep into enemy territory. Germany faced a different reality. Their synthetic fuel program, dependent on coal conversion, was technically sound but painfully slow and resource-draining. Even at peak production, they produced only a fraction of what flowed from American refineries. Most German fighters ran on B4 fuel at roughly 91 octane. Their premium C3 fuel, used primarily in Focke-Wulf 190s and select Messerschmitt variants, approximated Allied 130 grade but arrived in far smaller quantities. By 1944, perhaps two-thirds of German aviation fuel was C3 grade, but even that represented only a small fraction of Allied production. Understanding what made this fuel work required grasping something fundamental about how engines function. Octane ratings measure detonation resistance, how much a fuel resists igniting before it's supposed to. When a piston compresses the air-fuel mixture, temperature and pressure spike violently. If the fuel spontaneously ignites before the spark plug fires, catastrophe follows. Detonation creates shock waves that shred engine components. Higher octane means the fuel tolerates higher compression without detonating. By definition, octane ratings max out at 100, because 100 octane means the fuel performs like pure iso-octane, the reference standard. Performance numbers measure superiority beyond that theoretical limit. A 150 performance fuel means it can handle 50% more compression than pure iso-octane before detonating. Creating such a fuel meant adding anti-knock compounds, primarily tetraethyl lead, combined with careful blending of aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene into the base gasoline. British fuel chemists at the Royal Aircraft Establishment tested blends throughout 1942 and 1943, searching for the perfect balance between anti-knock performance, energy content, and production feasibility. American researchers at Wright Field ran parallel investigations, sharing data across the Atlantic. By early 1943, both nations had produced experimental batches of what they called 150-grade fuel. The naming was slightly misleading. It didn't mean an actual 150-octane rating, which was chemically impossible. It meant a fuel with a performance number of 150 on the rich mixture setting, combined with 100-octane performance on the lean mixture side. This fuel came dyed purple for instant identification and underwent intense testing through 1943. Results exceeded everything hoped for. Merlin engines running on this fuel could hold manifold pressures of 75 inches of mercury compared to 67 inches on 130 grade. That translated directly into horsepower. A Packard Merlin V1657, the engine powering the P-51D Mustang, generated 1,490 horsepower on standard military power with 130 grade fuel. Running on 150 grade at war emergency settings, that same engine produced 1,720 horsepower. In the earlier P-51B, with its V1653 variant, power output pushed to approximately 1,600 horsepower. The testing at Wright Field confirmed the performance gains were genuine across every flight regime. Maximum speed increased by 25 to 30 miles per hour at altitude. Climb rate improved by several hundred feet per minute. The revelation, all these improvements appeared with zero modifications to the aircraft itself. The identical Mustang, flown one day on 130 grade fuel and the next on 150 grade, became demonstrably faster, more powerful, simply because of chemistry flowing through its fuel lines. The decision to deploy 150 grade fuel to operational squadrons came in early 1944. The timing wasn't random. The 8th Air Force, based in England and flying daylight strategic bombing missions deep into Germany, was bleeding pilots and bombers at rates leadership considered unsustainable. The first P-51 Mustangs had arrived in December 1943, but German fighters were still tearing into bomber formations with brutal efficiency. What American planners needed wasn't just an escort fighter with long range. They needed an escort fighter so fast that German pilots couldn't refuse combat, couldn't escape if they tried, couldn't dictate the terms of engagement anymore. In May 1944, the first shipments of 150-grade fuel arrived in England. Distribution was controlled carefully. Not every fighter group received the new fuel immediately. The 8th Air Force started with select squadrons, partly to manage supply, partly to evaluate real combat performance. The Royal Air Force, which had pioneered much of the early testing, also began equipping fighter squadrons. Priority went to pilots tasked with high-speed interception missions, particularly those hunting German V-1 flying bombs that began terrorizing London in June 1944. These weapons flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at low altitude. Catching them meant fighter aircraft capable of matching or exceeding that speed near sea level, where thinner air degraded all aircraft performance. Hawker Tempests and Spitfire 14s barely managed it. Mustangs on standard fuel were marginal at best. Mustangs on 150-grade fuel had the speed margin needed for reliable interception. On June 18, 1944, Major R.E. Turner of the 356th Fighter Squadron destroyed a V-1 by using a technique of terrifying precision. He tipped the flying bomb's wing with his P-51's wingtip. This maneuver would be repeated at least 16 times during the campaign. It demanded exceptional speed and millimeter-perfect positioning, getting that wingtip within 6 inches of the V-1's wing, then using airflow to roll it off course and send it earthward. The first major combat use of 150-grade fuel by American P-51 pilots came in June 1944, coinciding with the Normandy invasion. Fighter groups of the 8th Air Force, tasked with gaining air superiority over the beaches, flew combat air patrols and bomber escorts, running the new fuel. German pilot reports started flooding back. Mustangs were performing beyond previous experience. Luftwaffe intelligence officers collected accounts describing American fighters that couldn't be caught in any flight regime, that accelerated away from German interceptors with ease, that seemed to possess power reserves that made no sense. These reports were initially dismissed. German pilots, the intelligence officers reasoned, were exhausted, outnumbered, watching friends die daily. Their talk of superior American fighters was stress and fatigue, not reality. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong, though that truth wouldn't emerge until after the war ended. Gunther Roll, a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, mostly accumulated on the Eastern Front, flew combat missions against American fighters over Germany in 1944. Decades later, in interviews conducted during the 1970s and 1980s, Roll reflected on those encounters with late-war Mustangs. He described shock at American fighter performance during that final year. Later, when Roll had opportunity to test fly captured American aircraft, including the P-51, P-47, and P-38, he found the Mustang particularly impressive. Speed, climb capability, high-altitude performance all exceeded his expectations. What Roll and other German pilots didn't realize during combat was that they were engaging an aircraft chemically enhanced beyond its original design specifications, operating at power settings the original Mustang engineers had never anticipated. The Merlin engine, designed by Rolls-Royce and built under license by Packard, had been engineered with meticulous attention to thermal limits, bearing loads, and detonation safety margins. Running engines at higher boost pressures pushed all these parameters toward their limits. What made 150-grade fuel revolutionary was that it allowed engines to operate at these extreme thresholds without catastrophic detonation, the engine-destroying explosion that would have resulted if they'd tried running the same boost pressures on lower-grade fuel. The chemistry involved complex interactions between fuel molecules, air molecules, heat, and pressure inside the combustion chamber. Tetraethyl lead, the primary anti-knock additive, worked by interrupting the chemical chain reactions leading to spontaneous ignition. But this came with costs. Tetraethyl lead was toxic, requiring careful handling by ground crews. It deposited residue on spark plugs, valves, and cylinder walls, increasing maintenance demands. 150-grade fuel with its elevated lead content accelerated all these degradation issues. Fighter groups using the new fuel experienced more frequent spark plug fouling and increased cylinder wear. American maintenance procedures adapted quickly. Spark plug replacement intervals shortened. Engine inspections became more frequent. Overhaul schedules shifted. The performance gains justified the increased maintenance burden. For pilots, transitioning to 150-grade fuel meant learning new operating procedures. Manifold pressure limits increased. Pilots had to learn discipline, resisting temptation to overboost engines, particularly at low altitudes where air density was highest. Most critically, pilots had to master fuel consumption management. The new fuel provided more power, but running at maximum boost drank fuel with alarming speed. Escort missions to Berlin and back already pushed the Mustang's range to absolute limits. Using this fuel's full capability meant knowing precisely when to apply maximum power and when to throttle back for cruise efficiency. Combat reports from summer and fall 1944 document the transformation. 8th Air Force fighter groups equipped with the new fuel reported higher victory-to-loss ratios and dramatically increased ability to intercept German fighters attempting to attack bomber streams. German fighters that had previously executed fast slashing attacks and escaped now found themselves unable to outrun pursuing Mustangs. On August 6, 1944, Lieutenant Hollis Bud Norlin of the 357th Fighter Group, flying Operation Frantic missions to Soviet air bases, encountered German fighters over Eastern Europe. In his P-51D named Hell's Bells, running 150-grade fuel, Norlin engaged a Messerschmitt BF-109 flown by Gunther Schack. The speed advantage proved decisive. He closed rapidly, fired and damaged the German fighter's cooling system. Low on fuel and ammunition, Norlin broke off, actually waved to the German pilot before returning to escort duties. Schack managed to bring his severely damaged aircraft down in a belly landing near the German positions. 40 years later, he would still marvel at why the American pilot hadn't destroyed him completely, unaware that Norlin had simply believed he'd crippled the plane rather than finished it off. When historians eventually tracked down both men and organized a reunion in Germany, Schack acknowledged something that had haunted him for decades. That American Mustang had performed in ways he'd never seen before. Nothing in his experience matched what that aircraft could do. The speed at which Norlin had closed the gap proved shocking. The way that fighter still had power reserves left, the way it could maneuver with such authority, it was nothing like previous encounters with American fighters. For Luftwaffe pilots watching from the ground or hearing the stories afterward, the psychological impact was enormous. They were already outnumbered. They were already facing superior Allied numbers. Now they had to confront American fighters that seemed to possess reserves of performance they couldn't match. Their choices became brutally simple. They could attempt coordinated mass attacks, hoping that sheer numbers might overwhelm the American escorts. They could refuse to fight at all, preserving what fighters and pilots they had left. Or they could engage the Mustangs and almost certainly get shot down, because these American aircraft were faster, more agile, and flown by pilots growing more confident and more aggressive with every mission. When Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring caught his first glimpse of P-51 Mustangs flying over Berlin, his famous words reflected the desperation of the situation. He knew then that Germany had lost the war. That single observation captured the entire strategic nightmare facing the Luftwaffe. The Mustang's range meant that nowhere inside Germany remained safe from American daylight bombing runs. Then, in mid-1944, everything got worse. The Americans introduced superior fuel, and the Luftwaffe's world changed. Luftwaffe technical intelligence managed to obtain samples of this new Allied fuel from captured drop tanks and shot-down aircraft. Hermann fuel chemists examined the samples carefully and reached a conclusion that German pilots had been reporting for weeks. The Americans had developed aviation gasoline with performance characteristics that German synthetic fuel plants simply couldn't match. Some late-war German C3 fuel approached these performance numbers, at least on paper, but production remained limited and quality control was inconsistent. The bombing campaign proved relentless. Allied strikes against German synthetic fuel plants, particularly the devastating raids on Leuna and other major production facilities in May and June of 1944, crippled German fuel production capabilities. By the final months of 1944, the Luftwaffe was rationing fuel down to the drop. Fighter units received priority access, but even they operated under severe constraints. The training pipeline for new pilots dried up. Many German pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight experience, while American pilots typically logged several hundred hours before seeing combat. Between January and May 1944, before widespread availability of the new fuel, American bombers lost approximately 3 to 6% of their strength per mission. These losses were manageable but steady. After June 1944, once the new fuel became standard and air superiority was achieved, those losses dropped below 2%. Fighter victories climbed sharply. Across the 8th, 9th, and 15th Air Forces, P-51 groups claimed approximately 4,150 German aircraft destroyed through air combat between late 1943 and May of 1945. The bulk of those victories occurred after June 1944. The German pilot force, which had entered 1944 with considerable experience despite severe losses in the East, was methodically eliminated. By dawn on June 6, 1944, only 2 Luftwaffe aircraft appeared over the Normandy beaches. The Luftwaffe possessed thousands of fighters in its inventory, but lacked the fuel to fly them, lacked trained pilots to fly them, and lacked the tactical flexibility to employ them effectively. The technical properties of this new fuel warrant examination. With a lean mixture octane rating of 100, it resisted detonation just like pure iso-octane when engines operated at cruise settings. With a rich mixture performance number of 150, it could withstand 50% more compression than iso-octane during maximum power situations. This remarkable combination allowed pilots to cruise efficiently for maximum distance, then switch to rich mixtures at high power for combat, confident that the engine would tolerate extreme boost pressures without detonating. The handling of this new fuel required special protocols due to its high tetraethyl lead content. Ground crews wore protective equipment during refueling operations. Any spills got cleaned up immediately to prevent lead poisoning. Fuel trucks and storage tanks carried clear markings to prevent accidental mixing of fuel grades. Safety records remained excellent despite the precautions. Industrial accidents were uncommon. Transition in combat squadrons required systematic pilot training. Pilots received briefings on the fuel's characteristics and updated procedures for engine operation. Manifold pressure limits were adjusted upward. Operational guidelines made clear when and how maximum power settings could be employed. Aircraft themselves needed no modifications. Fuel systems and all components worked equally well with both fuel types. This compatibility streamlined logistics and simplified field operations. Production numbers tell a remarkable story of industrial mobilization. Between May 1944 and April 1945, the 8th Air Force alone consumed more than 53 million gallons of this fuel. Allied production across all refineries likely exceeded 200 million gallons during active operations. Each gallon represented refining infrastructure, chemical additives including toxic tetraethyl lead compounds, quality control testing, transportation across the Atlantic, secure storage in protected facilities, and distribution to dozens of airfields scattered across England. American industrial capacity in 1944 operated at levels that seemed almost fantastic. Factories produced bombers in the thousands and fighters in the tens of thousands. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than Germany could possibly sink them. Oil refineries generated aviation gasoline in quantities that surpassed Germany's total fuel production across all fuel grades combined. This achievement flowed from decades of industrial development, vast natural resources, a homeland protected from enemy bombing, and a workforce that included millions of women who entered factories to support the war effort. The Royal Air Force employed this fuel extensively in fighter operations across Europe. British squadrons flying Spitfire 14s, Tempest Virs, and Mustang 3s and IVs received high-priority allocation of the new fuel. RAF pilots reported identical performance improvements experienced by their American counterparts. The Tempest, already among the fastest piston-engine fighters in service, became even more formidable. Tempest squadrons achieved remarkable results against the V-1 flying bombs. Between June and September 1944, RAF 150 Wing Tempests shot down 638 flying bombs, with No. 3 Squadron alone accounting for 305 of them. Squadron leader Joseph Barry destroyed 59 V-1s. Belgian squadron leader Remy van Leider destroyed 44. Wing commander Roland Beaumont destroyed 31. The next most successful interceptors were Mosquitoes, with 623 victories, Spitfire 14s with 303, and Mustangs with 232. The performance advantage proved invaluable across every mission type. Combat effectiveness of the new fuel was demonstrated repeatedly through late 1944 and early 1945. Spitfire groups receiving the fuel reported increased victory claims and reduced losses. By March 1945, nearly every P-51 unit was operating on this fuel. Combat reports from this period reveal overwhelmingly one-sided encounters. German fighters rarely mounted effective challenges against Allied formations. When combat occurred, German losses were typically severe. By April 1945, missions over Germany often encountered no aerial opposition whatsoever. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed through fuel shortages and the systematic elimination of experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The air war over Europe concluded with complete Allied air supremacy. This supremacy resulted from multiple factors. The P-51's extraordinary range mattered enormously. American pilot training was superior. Allied numerical advantages were overwhelming. However, the petroleum engineering advantage provided by the new fuel was significant and measurable. That purple-tinted gasoline transformed good fighters into exceptional ones, inspired confidence in Allied pilots, and represented the technological and industrial might of nations capable of outproducing, out-innovating, and ultimately outlasting their adversaries. Speed determines aerial combat outcomes. A faster fighter controls when to engage and when to disengage. A faster fighter possesses tactical options slower opponents cannot access. When American fighters became demonstrably faster through excellent airframe design combined with superior fuel, the Luftwaffe's tactical options contracted severely. The comparison between German and Allied situations in late 1944 and early 1945 was striking. Allied fighters completed multiple combat missions daily, constrained only by pilot fatigue and aircraft maintenance requirements. German fighters frequently remained grounded, starved for fuel. When they did fly, strict fuel conservation rules limited their combat capability severely. A German pilot, burning excessive fuel in combat, might find insufficient fuel remaining for the return journey. An Allied pilot used full power whenever needed, knowing adequate reserves existed for the return flight. This operational flexibility carried strategic weight. Allied fighters sustained standing patrols, reacted aggressively to threats, and maintained continuous operations. German fighters required careful planning, rigid fuel conservation, and often disengaged from combat, not because they were losing, but because fuel reserves were running dangerously low. Luftwaffe pilots flew knowing every mission might be their last, not from enemy fire, but from empty tanks. American pilots flew with confidence born from material superiority. They understood their aircraft were faster, their fuel abundant, their support systems robust. This confidence produced more aggressive flying, superior combat results, and higher survival rates. The story of this new fuel represents industrial warfare at its core. Victory belonged to the side that could produce not just more aircraft, but better performing aircraft. Not just adequate fuel, but superior fuel. Not just sufficient trained pilots, but an overwhelming surplus of highly trained pilots supported by industrial capacity that replaced losses faster than enemies could inflict them. American and British fuel chemists working in laboratories and refineries never flew combat missions over Germany. They never faced anti-aircraft fire or enemy fighters. Yet their work, measured in performance numbers and manifold pressure readings, helped determine who controlled European skies in 1944 and 1945. Every time a P-51 pilot pushed throttle forward and felt his Mustang surge ahead with power that German fighters couldn't match, he benefited from chemical engineering that transformed crude petroleum into fuel capable of making the exceptional routine. German planners had assumed American fighters would perform within predictable parameters based on aircraft design and standard fuel capabilities. What they encountered instead were fighters whose performance exceeded their calculations, sustained by fuel production infrastructure so vast and sophisticated that it represented industrial capacity Germany could not challenge. By spring 1945, as Allied armies swept across Germany from east and west, the Luftwaffe had effectively stopped existing as an organized fighting force. A few units still flew, often with barely enough fuel for a single sortie. Jet fighters like the May 262 represented technological advancement, but arrived too late in too few numbers, handicapped by fuel scarcity and absence of experienced pilots systematically destroyed in combat. The final calculations show cumulative Allied advantages. American P-51 groups across all theaters flew hundreds of thousands of fighter sorties. They claimed approximately 4,150 enemy aircraft destroyed through air combat and another 4,131 destroyed on the ground. These figures represented not merely aircraft destroyed, but pilots killed, experience eliminated, and German industrial capacity squandered. Building replacements themselves destroyed before achieving any strategic value. This new fuel wasn't solely responsible for this outcome, but its contribution was substantial. It provided the margin of superiority that transformed a close contest into decisive victory. The 448 miles per hour that a properly boosted P-51 could achieve represented not merely velocity, but also technological superiority and industrial might. This was what German planners hadn't anticipated, that American fuel engineers working far from any combat zone could create a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb. That purple-tinted gasoline could influence aerial combat as decisively as superior tactics or better training. The key to air supremacy over Europe in 1945 involved compression ratios of piston engines, anti-knock properties of aromatic hydrocarbons, and performance numbers of aviation fuel that exceeded anything Germany could produce. The P-51 Mustangs flying over Berlin in early 1944 were magnificent aircraft. The P-51 Mustangs flying over Berlin in early 1945 were identical aircraft, yet powered by fuel that made them faster, more powerful, and more effective. That difference, measured in octane numbers and performance ratings, in manifold pressure readings and airspeed indicators, was among the many differences that determined who would win Europe's aerial war. In that determination lay Nazi Germany's fate and the demonstration of Allied industrial power expressed as purple liquid pumped into fuel tanks, burned in powerful engines, and transformed into victory one combat mission at a time.